Before this story begins, listen closely, because what you're about to hear isn't just a story, it's a reminder that life can change in a single morning. A tired black single father wakes up expecting another day of struggle, and instead finds the most powerful woman in his city standing in his kitchen wearing his shirt. What she says next will freeze him in place, and it will change everything he believes about power, love, and survival. If you believe real stories still matter, if you believe second chances can come disguised as disasters, then subscribe now, because stories like this don't just entertain, they stay with you. Malcolm Reed woke up the way he always did, before the sun had fully decided to rise, the cheap alarm buzzing beside him, the weight of responsibility already pressing against his chest before his eyes even opened, his mind running through the same checklist it always did. Lunch money for his daughter Ava, the bus schedule, whether the electricity bill had truly been paid or just delayed again, whether his back would hold up through another 12-hour warehouse shift. But then he smelled something that didn't belong in his apartment, something warm and expensive and unmistakably not instant coffee, and that was when his eyes opened and his breath stopped, because standing barefoot in his narrow kitchen, sunlight spilling through cracked blinds, was a woman he recognized instantly even though she should not have existed in his world at all, wearing his old gray work shirt like it belonged to her, sleeves rolled up, dark hair loose around her shoulders, calm and unafraid, stirring eggs in his chipped pan as if this was the most natural place in the world for her to be. And Malcolm's first thought was that he was still dreaming, his second thought was that stress had finally snapped something in his brain, and his third thought, sharp, cold, terrifying, was that this woman was Eleanor Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Industries, the same woman whose face stared down from billboards, news panels, magazine covers, the woman people called the Iron Queen of corporate London and New York, and before he could speak, before he could move, before he could understand how reality had bent this far out of shape, she turned, met his eyes, and said quietly, "Malcolm Reed, I need you not to panic, because what I'm about to tell you will explain everything, and ruin everything." And he stood there frozen, bare feet on cold linoleum, heart pounding so hard he was sure Ava would hear it from her bedroom, because no version of his life included this moment, and yet here it was, breathing, real, impossible, and the woman who controlled billions of dollars and thousands of employees was standing in his kitchen wearing his shirt, holding his spatula, and looking at him like he was the most important person in the room, and as she spoke, Malcolm's entire understanding of his past began to crack open, because she told him she hadn't come by accident, she told him she had been searching for him for years, she told him the night before, when he'd helped a stranded woman in the rain without recognizing her, was never supposed to happen, but fate, cruel and deliberate, had finally cornered them both, and when she said the name of his late wife in a voice that trembled just enough to betray the truth beneath her steel exterior, Malcolm knew this wasn't a dream at all, it was a reckoning, because Eleanor Whitmore knew things about his life no stranger should ever know. She knew why his wife had died, she knew why the insurance never paid out, she knew why Malcolm had been quietly blacklisted from promotions despite flawless performance reviews, and when she said, "Your wife saved my life once, and I failed her in return," Malcolm felt the room tilt. Because grief doesn't disappear with time. It waits, patient, for the moment it can hurt you again, and this woman had just reopened a wound he'd barely survived. Eleanor didn't sit down when she spoke, she stood like a woman used to delivering verdicts, but her voice softened as she explained how years earlier, before the headlines, before the empire, she had been reckless, vulnerable, human, trapped in a collapsing marriage and a corporate war she wasn't sure she could win, and it was Malcolm's wife, kind, brilliant, invisible to the powerful world, that had intervened one rainy night outside a hospital, pulling Eleanor back from a decision that would have ended everything, and Eleanor had promised then, in desperation and gratitude, that she would help one day, but life moved fast for the powerful and slow for the struggling, and promises rot when they're buried under success, until last night, until a broken-down car, a man who refused payment, a child's drawing taped to a dashboard, and a familiar kindness that felt like a ghost reaching out of the past, and Eleanor confessed that she had known Malcolm's name for years but had never dared to face him, because power can fix many things but it can't undo cowardice, and when Malcolm finally found his voice, it wasn't anger that came out, it was exhaustion, the kind only single parents carry, the kind built from years of showing up when nobody is watching, and he asked her one question that cut deeper than any accusation. "Did my wife die thinking she didn't matter?" And Eleanor broke then, just a crack, just enough for tears to fall silently onto his kitchen floor, and she said no, she died believing the world could be better, believing people like Malcolm would keep holding it together one day at a time, and that was why Eleanor was there now, not to offer money, not to erase pain, but to give the truth, because secrets rot families from the inside, and Malcolm deserved more than silence, and as Ava walked into the kitchen rubbing sleep from her eyes, Eleanor knelt without hesitation, introduced herself simply as Eleanor, and listened as Ava explained her school project with the seriousness only children possess, and Malcolm saw then that this woman, terrifying and powerful and flawed, was not the enemy he'd imagined, but she wasn't the savior either, because salvation doesn't come from billionaires, it comes from choices, and Eleanor's choice was to step out from behind glass towers and into accountability, and when she offered Malcolm a job, not charity but leadership, overseeing a division designed to protect workers like him from being erased, Malcolm hesitated, because accepting meant stepping into a world that had already taken so much from him. But refusing meant staying frozen in a life built on survival instead of possibility, and when Eleanor said, "I don't need you because you're desperate, I need you because you're honest," Malcolm felt something dangerous rise in his chest. Hope. And hope is terrifying when you've spent years learning how to live without it. What followed that impossible morning was not a clean transformation or a neatly tied redemption arc, but a slow, grinding collision between two worlds that had never been meant to touch, and Malcolm learned quickly that stepping into Eleanor Whitmore's orbit meant surrendering the quiet anonymity that had once protected him even as it suffocated him, because within days his name appeared in internal memos, then leaked emails, then finally whispered across social media and breakroom tables, the narrative twisting itself into something unrecognizable, some calling him a symbol of corporate guilt, others a calculated pawn, others a charity case dressed up as justice, and Malcolm felt the old instinct rise, the urge to retreat, to protect Ava by shrinking his presence, to survive by becoming invisible again, but invisibility had already cost him too much, and Eleanor, for all her flaws, refused to let the story be told without him in the room, insisting he attend meetings where men twice his salary spoke around him instead of to him. Until one afternoon Malcolm finally interrupted a polished executive mid-sentence and asked a question so simple it silenced the room, a question about safety protocols and overtime injuries that exposed how little the decision-makers understood the people whose bodies built their profits, and in that moment Eleanor didn't rescue him or redirect the conversation, she leaned back and let him speak, and something shifted, subtle but irreversible, because respect earned in discomfort lasts longer than praise handed out in comfort. At home, Ava sensed the change before Malcolm fully understood it himself, noticing how he checked his phone with tension instead of dread, how he spoke more carefully but stood a little straighter, and one night as they ate dinner she asked him whether rich people were allowed to be sad too, and the question hit him harder than any headline, because it reminded him that children observe truth long before they learn language for it, and Malcolm told her that sadness didn't check bank accounts, but responsibility did, and that some people took longer to learn how to carry it, and Ava nodded like that made perfect sense, then asked if Eleanor was coming over again, not with suspicion but curiosity, and Malcolm realized that children were far better judges of character than adults drowning in bias. The backlash intensified when a former Whitmore executive went public, accusing Eleanor of emotional manipulation, implying that Malcolm's wife's death had been leveraged for sympathy, and for the first time since Eleanor had entered his life, Malcolm felt anger sharpen into something dangerous, because grief should never be weaponized, and when reporters camped outside his building, microphones pointed toward his door like accusations, Eleanor arrived without security, stood beside him, and said nothing until Malcolm spoke first, and when he did, his voice didn't shake, because truth has weight when it's carried long enough, and he said that no amount of money could buy back the nights he'd cried quietly so his daughter wouldn't hear, that no promotion erased the memory of signing hospice papers alone, and that Eleanor Whitmore hadn't given him dignity, she had finally acknowledged it, and that distinction mattered, and the crowd fell quiet, because people can argue with power but they struggle to argue with lived truth spoken plainly. Behind closed doors, the relationship between Malcolm and Eleanor evolved with careful boundaries, neither pretending it was simple or pure, both aware of the imbalance that still existed, and yet something honest grew in the spaces where neither could hide behind titles, late-night conversations about regret and fear, about the loneliness of leadership and the exhaustion of survival, about how both of them had learned to be strong in ways that left no room for softness, and one evening Eleanor admitted that success had insulated her from consequences but not from emptiness, that every victory felt temporary because she was always outrunning the woman she had been when Malcolm's wife had saved her. And Malcolm listened without judgment, because he understood that being seen at your worst is sometimes the first step toward becoming better, and when Eleanor asked him whether he trusted her, Malcolm didn't answer immediately, because trust isn't a feeling, it's a decision, and he said finally that trust wasn't given all at once, it was built, brick by brick, through consistency, and Eleanor accepted that without offense, which surprised them both. The true test came when Whitmore Industries faced a lawsuit that threatened to dismantle the very division Malcolm now led, investors demanding cuts, lawyers advising silence, and Eleanor torn between preserving the empire and honoring the values she had publicly committed to, and Malcolm found himself at the center of a decision that could define him forever, because Eleanor asked for his honest recommendation knowing it might cost billions, and Malcolm remembered every time someone had chosen profit over people in his life, every corner cut that ended in injury or loss, and he told her that if the company survived by abandoning the workers it claimed to protect, then survival wasn't victory, and Eleanor made the call that night, standing against her board, absorbing the financial hit, and in doing so losing allies she had once thought indispensable. But when the ruling came down months later and the company emerged changed but intact, Eleanor understood that leadership without integrity is just control, and control without humanity eventually collapses under its own weight. For Malcolm, the reward was quieter but deeper, watching Ava give a presentation at school about her father's job not with embarrassment or pity but pride, seeing her draw pictures of futures that didn't revolve around scarcity, and one evening, standing again in that same kitchen where everything had begun, Eleanor reached for the old gray shirt folded neatly on a chair, smiling as she held it up, and Malcolm laughed, realizing that the moment that had once frozen him in fear had become a marker of transformation, not because a powerful woman had entered his life, but because truth had, and truth changes people who are brave enough to face it. In the end, Malcolm understood something he wished he could have told his wife, that impact isn't measured by how many people know your name, but by how many lives are steadier because you existed, and Eleanor, standing beside him not above him, learned that power is most meaningful when it listens, and as the city moved on to its next scandal, its next spectacle, Malcolm Reed woke up one morning to a life still imperfect, still demanding, but no longer defined by survival alone, and that was the greatest twist of all, because what had left him frozen that first morning had not been shock or fear, but the realization that sometimes the past comes back not to punish you, but to ask whether you're finally ready to step forward.